Eva Badra, and I am the president of Students for Justice in Palestine. And I would like thank you guys all for coming. This is an amazing turnout, more than I could have ever imagined in my wildest dreams. I'd like to introduce Professor Norman Finkelstein, who's a renowned author and activist, political scientist, in particular about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has authored several books and is critically acclaimed, and I hope you enjoy his lecture today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me here this evening, and that was a gratifyingly brief introduction, so we can get on to the business of the evening. And I look forward to having a chance to speak to everybody in the room. And the topic I plan on speaking on, I think, is particularly germane, relevant to this evening, because for the past several decades, when I spoke on the Israel-Palestine conflict, most of my remarks have been devoted to trying to simply juxtapose the scholarly record, the documentary record on the conflict, next to the way the conflict is depicted in the media and the way most of us understand the conflict, and to try to demonstrate that there's a fairly large divide, you might call it a chasm, an abyss, separating the way the conflict looks in the documentary record, looks in the scholarly record, with the way it's depicted. And that was, we can use the term, my modus operandi for the past, you could say, 25 years. But now I think new historical opportunities have opened up, new political opportunities have opened up, and we have to do our best to take advantage, to exploit or capitalize on those opportunities to finally put an end to the conflict, to transform it from a subject of current events to a topic which will be perhaps studied in history books, but should finally reach its conclusion. Because there's something manifestly preposterous about how long this conflict has endured, and how tiny a pinprick Israel and Palestine are on the world's map, and why it can't find a resolution. I'm sure in a century from now, if humanity survives, they will look back with utter perplexity, complete bewilderment, on why this tiny little spot on the world's map has preoccupied so many people's time and couldn't find a resolution. But I do think the time might now be ripe. There might be a possibility, of course there's no certainty, but there's a possibility that the conflict can reach a resolution. And so tonight I'm going to speak on the topic of a forthcoming book with a close Palestinian friend of mine, co-authored with him, entitled How to Solve the Israel-Palestine Conflict. And I'll try to lay out a general sketch of what I think a resolution should look like and can look like, and hopefully will look like if we do the right thing. And it's all the more important then that we have all sides of the conflict represented in the room this evening. Because if the laboratory experiment of presenting a resolution is to have any meaning, well, the resolution has to resonate in some way for not everyone on both sides, but certainly for reasonable people on both sides. And so I, for one, am very glad that people from all sides managed to make it in the room. And I was a little bit concerned when I saw that large portion of the representation from the other side was not going to make it in. So that's all a long way of saying, let's take advantage of the opportunity for everybody to be here. I'll present what seems to me a reasonable way of conceiving a resolution to the conflict, and then hopefully we'll have time enough, and I'll probably abbreviate my remarks because I have to catch a bus, and that puts some constraints on me, but I may abbreviate my remarks because I want to have a chance for everybody to have their say and maybe even register a vote for or against on how to resolve the problem. As I said, I do think there are now significant new opportunities for trying to achieve a resolution of the conflict. And those opportunities in large part result from developments in the Middle East, but also more broadly internationally, and also developments right here in the United States of America. The point of departure is, of course, the Arab Spring and the new movements that have emerged, and also in recent times, new governments that seem to be consolidating power, which have, because they represent the democratic aspirations of the people in the Arab world, because they represent the democratic aspirations, they are more forceful in their demand that Palestinians achieve their justice in the course of the Arab Spring. The most notable developments began actually before the Arab Spring, when Israel's historical ally in the Middle East, namely Turkey, Israel's main ally in the Muslim world, namely Turkey, has slowly in recent months, or we can say in the past year, has been championing the cause of the Palestinians. It's hard to say at this point the extent to which the actual performance of the Turkish government will rise to the level of the rhetoric, and there does seem to be a significant gap between the Prime Minister Erdogan, his rhetoric, and his actions. But nonetheless, it's quite clear that Turkey has become a forceful proponent of the rights of the people of Palestine. After that, if Turkey was Israel's main ally in the Muslim world, it's true then to say that Egypt was Israel's main ally in the Arab world. And in the case of, if we all remain very calm, and frankly, I'm of the British parliamentary school where you're allowed to call out once in a while a clever remark. We don't all have to just sit as passive robots in the audience. It's okay. In the case of Egypt, there has been obviously significant changes. Again, it's hard to gauge how forceful will be the support that Egypt lends to the Palestinians. But clearly there has been a change of public representation in Egypt, and clearly it's been supportive of the rights of the Palestinians. If you look at the region more broadly, or I should say, if you look at the picture more broadly, namely the global picture, there's no doubt that Israel's stock has dramatically plummeted. Israel's stock has there's no question that Israel's stock has dramatically plummeted in the last decade or so. So if you take the example, the BBC World Service, they conduct annual polls. And the annual poll is pretty simple. It asks the question, do you think this country has had overwhelmingly a positive effect on the world or a negative effect on the world? And every year, for you could say about the last 10 years, 4 countries consistently come in as having overwhelmingly a negative effect. The 4 countries are Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, and Israel. Israel is always, this is a little bit problematic because I'm not sure if you're standing for Iran or for Israel. But Israel always comes in at the bottom with Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. And that's a quite remarkable fact, because if you look at news coverage, obviously news coverage of Iran is overwhelmingly negative. News coverage of Pakistan is overwhelmingly negative. News coverage of North Korea is beyond negative, but depending on the coverage, Israel either gets moderate to overwhelmingly positive coverage. And yet the public has registered nonetheless such an overwhelmingly negative picture of Israel as to put it in the same category as Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. The most recent example was when the Palestinians put in their bid for statehood, and BBC did a World Service poll. Every single country in the world where they asked the question, the support for the Palestinian bid for statehood was either a plurality or a majority. There were no exceptions. And when I say there were no exceptions, that also includes, incidentally, the United States. There were 2 polls done in the US on whether or not the American people, or the sampling, whether or not they supported the Palestinian bid for statehood. And in each poll, one was done by Pew and one was done by BBC. In each poll, a plurality, about 45% of Americans said they supported the bid for statehood. And depending on the poll, between 25% and 35% said they opposed it. Now, that's a very remarkable fact, because in the US, the Palestinian bid for statehood was a high-profile news issue.